Hey there, YouTube. It's Kurt here. Today we're going to take a look at Samus in every matchup that she has in Super Smash Bros. Melee. And I want to overview this by saying that every 20 years later, Super Smash Bros. Melee still isn't a completely solved metagame. We don't have a lot of Samus players out there, and there's a lot of tech that still has been maximized with her. It's crazy that it's almost 20 years later, 2 decades, and we still don't know everything about this game. And I understand a lot of the tiers at the top, we pretty much objectively know that Fox and Falco are pretty much the best characters because they don't really have weak matchups. But other than that, outside of that, they are very beatable characters as well. And there's particularly 2 unsolved metas when it comes to Samus and Luigi. I think most people would agree on that in general. And now Pikachu just recently won a super major a couple years ago, which is actually really, really exciting. So with that preface in mind, I think Samus has a ton of potential that is being underutilized because it really takes a lot of commitment to understand how to maximize her effectiveness. Now, with that in mind, I want to get on and start with, I will go from the high tiers to the low tiers, and I'm going to skip over some matchups because I feel like some matchups are just kind of self-evident and not really going to be useful for the common player. But if we start at the top, I will try to point out various details which might be relevant to the matchup. Now, I think it's universally agreed upon that Samus has pretty much an even matchup with Fox. I actually think this is one of the most enjoyable matchups to watch in general. Fox doesn't really have anything unfair over Samus. Shine obviously is unfair, but Samus really has the tools to overcome that and kind of play around with Fox. And if you get the timing right, she definitely has all the tools to allow the Fox matchup to be very, very winnable. Now, I don't want to spend any more time on that one, Fox. I think we've seen enough Fox matchups to where we can say that is an extremely winnable matchup. But when it comes to Falco, I actually think Falco is a little bit... We don't see this accurately when it comes to this matchup. It might be seen as being a little bit even, but I think Falco is actually a soft counterpick to Samus. Because I think one thing that's happening nowadays is like a lot of people are playing around with... they're getting much, much better at Falco being able to box other characters in, especially with the hit stun when it comes to the laser. I think that's actually might be the most unfair thing about the matchup is that the laser has hit stun when it comes to Falco. And I think when you see this in actual replays, you'll see the better players are really, really effective at their approaches with Samus, and especially at the larger stages. If you're going to be playing Dreamland or you're going to be playing FD, these differences are really, really going to start to show themselves, and that's when basically Falco can basically camp the map and wait and just wait for the prime opportune moment to go in on Samus and be able to take really, really, really strong advantage of that. So I actually feel like that's a soft counterpick, but still very winnable against most Falcos. And if you know what you're doing, you can still kind of mitigate that laser 2 a little bit, but it's going to be very annoying, and you're going to have to time your shields very, very well, and that's going to be a hard thing to do. And definitely on those 2 stages I mentioned in particular, Falco can very, very hard camp Samus, and you're going to have a much harder time on those stages, in my personal opinion. Now we're going to move on to Marth. In my opinion, this is absolutely the worst matchup that Samus has. If we look in replays here, we can see that Samus has a terrible, terrible time with the advantage of the disjointed sword. Even the regular grapple doesn't even have the length to surpass Marth's sword, which is absolutely just terrible. We have projectiles, but the projectiles don't really have... They're very easily for Marth to dance around, and the disjointed hitboxes also ensure that even if you fire them, they can pretty much just sword it away, and they have much better approach options overall. The tough thing is you can semi-play around this and you can time it right, but essentially Marth has much easier opportunities to punish Samus than Samus has in the opposite direction, just because Marth has that weird range of floatiness that allows him to combo her while she's in the air, and there just becomes a certain point where she just gets edge guarded to death, and it's one of the matchups that can make you understand very, very quickly why Marth has this reputation as being a very easy to pilot character. I want to preface that by saying that every character is hard to master in Melee, but some are easier to pick up than others, and I think Marth falls into that category. Now, that's all I will say about Marth. I think it's the worst matchup. I think it's actually a counter pick. It's just terrible. It's pretty much the main reason why you just cannot go solo Samus in the tournament. It's just because Marth exists. If a Marth player loses to Samus, it's probably because the Marth player is just absolutely horrendous. All right, so now we're going to move on to Chic. I actually think this is a little bit better than people give it credit for, just because I think Samus has a lot more zoning options than I think people give her credit for. And one thing we don't see very often is zoning with her bomb. I don't think a lot of players take that into consideration. If they put that into their playstyles a little bit more, they would be able to box certain characters in a lot more. And Chic has closing speed, of course, but I think it's something that's pretty easily manipulated overall. So I think Samus can actually has a lot of viable options against Chic overall. Even though Chic has really good ledge guarding options, I think Samus just has the tools to play around that just because she's a very technical player. And if you have those technical aspects in your gameplay, it's a very, very much so a much more winnable matchup. Now, Jigglypuff. I have no idea why Jigglypuff is listed as a soft counter in the wiki. Maybe it's because of the traditional history of this character. I think maybe a lot of Samus players aren't used to the matchup overall, but I think there's one very simple thing. I think Jigglypuff is actually incredibly easy to zone when it comes to projectiles, especially when it comes to Samus's projectiles overall. Most Jigglypuff players can't play around something so simple as the bomb spam. If you bomb spam in place, there's a lot of Jigglypuff players that will take up 30 damage, and you can create so many plays off of that in general. Jigglypuff does not really have very good zoning speed overall, and you can kind of spam rockets at her. There's just too many options that Samus has. I think actually it might actually be a worse matchup for Jigglypuff, but I think that's definitely a neutral matchup. When it comes to Peach, with the Peach matchup overall, I'm a little bit uncertain exactly what my opinion should be. I think Peach might have a slight edge. I'm not entirely sure, though, because Peach isn't huge into the metagame. She actually has a very unique approach options, which can play around Samus's projectiles, so it makes things awkward when it comes to zoning her. I don't think it's... I don't feel strongly any one way or the other. I think I'm inexperienced in the matchup, so I don't think I can fully comment on the matchup entirely. Ice climbers, since ice climbers can't wobble anymore, I think that's banned, right? All right, so I'm not going to comment on that. It's extremely winnable, especially if the ban of wobbling is a thing. Captain Falcon. All right, so Captain Falcon, I think is also still a very winnable matchup. I think people need to adjust their playstyles. The thing about Captain Falcon, most Falcon players, I will admit, even though we enjoy the more aggressive Falcon players, a lot of Falcon players kind of have a lame formulaic playstyle. And what I'll say is they have this technique of just approaching with a high chance attack, and if they fail their attack, they retreat and then attempt another approach, fast approach and attack. It's a very hit and run type of play style for most Falcon players, and I think that's something that Samus can definitely prepare for. You have to get your reads accurate, but I think Captain Falcon overall is very winnable. Obviously, he has very good hitboxes in general, but you have very good zoning and admittedly camping opportunities. Like if more Samus players would be willing to space out their playstyle, I feel like matchups like this, especially with players that are pretty much linear and have very predictable recoveries and trajectories, I think that closes the gap way more than we're willing to admit. All right, so Pikachu, very winnable matchup. Again, they have somewhat similar zoning capabilities, but I think Peach is just too light. The gimmick that Pikachu has in many scenarios doesn't apply to Samus because Pikachu kind of wants characters with faster fall speeds, so I don't think that Pikachu is really much of a problem. Dr. Mario, very winnable. Skip over Yoshi, huge win. Yoshi just has very much trouble with the zoning capabilities that Samus has. Not going to talk about that too much. And Luigi, pretty much the same story. I think Samus is actually a counter pick, not just a soft counter pick, but a counter pick to Luigi. Very, very solid overall. Ganondorf is actually a tough matchup for Samus. I actually fully agree with Ganondorf being a soft counter to Samus in general. He just has really awkward hitboxes. The hitboxes outrange her in many ways, and especially on smaller stages, he's just able to close really well on her, and he does a lot of damage. The moves do lots of damage in general, and that's a very tough thing for Samus to deal with. If you get off stage and you're just constantly trying to get in a position where you can punish Ganondorf, but he's kind of a harder punish than other characters because he falls so fast, and he just has really good defensive options in this matchup in particular. DK, I can't really comment on this too much because I haven't played the matchup, but I think DK might not be a soft counter. I understand she's floaty, but at the same time, you have a lot of options against a DK and his ability to do up air. So I don't think that's as bad as a lot of people give its credit for overall. A lot of people say Roy is super hard countered by Samus. I'm not sure how I feel about that in general. I think I think it's mostly due to reasons of hit stun, but he has completely the same moveset as Marth in general, and so I think the disjointed, the hitboxes and the hit stun being much different obviously is huge, but I don't think. I feel like Roy has a lot of the same capabilities in this matchup in advantages that Marth has, so I don't think it's as bad as people. Like, I've seen a lot of great Roy players out there, and the great Roy players will show you exactly how they can box you in. So there's that matchup. Samus doesn't have a singular bad matchup. Weirdly, Zelda has an even matchup, and it's just because she has such weird hitboxes and her own floatiness. I don't think this matchup, it can be a meme, but if you actually get bodied by Zelda, don't feel bad because Zelda actually just has a very weird matchup against Samus. All right, I think that's actually those are actually the most important matchups that we can actually analyze here. I don't think the other ones are really time-worthy. They have Link and Young Link listed. One is listed as a counter, and the other one is listed as Samus being the counter. I think those actually switch. Link is just so slow. That's just the problem with Link. I think Link is just so easily boxed in and manipulated because of how slow he is, just generally speaking. And Young Link is kind of the opposite. That's just my personal opinion. Hopefully this was a useful video for you guys. I'll try to be back with more videos in the future, but shout out to all my Samus players out there. Really underutilized, and again, it's amazing that we've come this far in Melee, and she hasn't really gotten the representation that she probably deserves. So hopefully she breaks in, she wins a Super Major one of these years, because she's a character that definitely has the tools to be able to do it.